Once upon a time in the 1500s, England was ruled by a man who looked like a Renaissance heartthrob, but loved like a medieval executioner. Meet Henry VIII, the man, the myth, the marriage serial killer. When he first took the throne in 1509, Henry was 17 years old, athletic, musical, well-educated, and described by contemporaries as the handsomest prince in Christendom. Sounds dreamy, right? Fast forward a few decades, and the only thing dreamy about Henry was the fantasy of getting through marriage with him without ending up divorced, dead, or emotionally destroyed. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. In a land known more for plague than passion, Henry was a bright hope for the future of the Tudor dynasty. The second monarch in his family line after his father, Henry VII, clawed his way to power following the War of the Roses, a conflict where England basically played 30 years of Game of Thrones, with slightly worse fashion. Henry's job was clear: stay in power, keep the nobles happy, and most importantly, produce a male heir. Because in the 1500s, if you didn't have a son, your legacy was one bad jousting accident away from collapsing. And here's where it gets messy. Henry was, from the start, obsessed with one thing: securing the throne with a line of male heirs as thick as his turkey legs. He wasn't entirely irrational about this. The medieval world had a serious allergy to female monarchs. A queen ruling alone was like using a fork to eat soup. Technically possible, but no one thought it should be done. The thought of a woman on the throne made many men in Parliament break out in hives and clutch their rosaries. So Henry took it upon himself to do the most logical thing: marry and keep marrying until he got a son, or until he ran out of wives. Whichever came first. At first, people were optimistic. Henry loved tournaments, music, theology and women, and not necessarily in that order. The court was buzzing, the jousts were thundering, and the royal kitchens were cooking enough meat to terrify a modern cardiologist. He wrote love songs, he composed poetry, he pranced around in tights. For a minute there he was Renaissance Tinder's most eligible bachelor. But the problem was, behind that glittering exterior lurked a dangerous flaw. This man took rejection, or lack of a male heir, as a personal insult from God. You didn't marry Henry VIII. You auditioned for the most perilous reality show in England. So you think you can produce a son. The rules were simple. Give birth to a boy, and you got a crown, a parade, and maybe even a smile from your husband. Fail, and suddenly everyone's whispering about your virtue, your looks, your womb, your foreign relatives, your hair, and your general failure to be divinely favoured. And all the while, Henry's eyes would start wandering across the royal banquet table toward the next unfortunate beauty, who smiled too brightly. Let's not forget the setting: 16th century England, a country teetering between Catholicism and Protestantism, where the Pope still held massive influence, and questioning royal authority could land you a one-way trip to the Tower. Add in plagues, revolts, and the delightful invention known as public execution, and you've got yourself a high-pressure environment for royal matchmaking. Every decision had religious and political consequences. A queen wasn't just a wife. She was an ambassador, a symbol, a producer of heirs, and an occasional scapegoat when things went sideways. And oh, they did go sideways. As Henry aged, he ballooned in size, his moods darkened, and he developed a festering leg wound that never healed. But his taste in wives didn't change. Young, preferably pretty, and blessed with the unfortunate ability to catch his eye at court, he believed himself divinely appointed, which meant every wife was supposed to be a divine match. But if things went south, he assumed God had changed the channel, and he needed a new leading lady. Being queen sounded great until you realized your husband changed wives, like some people change socks, violently, and with poor judgment. His definition of irreconcilable differences included things like aging, not having sons, and making too much eye contact with the court musician. Worse yet, each new marriage became a national drama. Henry wasn't just looking for love. He was rewriting religion, altering succession laws, and starting wars over his love life. The man invented divorce as a national policy, then started his own church to make it happen. But you can't understand the horror of being one of Henry's wives unless you understand the expectations placed on women at the time. Queens weren't seen as partners. They were glorified incubators with fancy titles. Your job was to look good, act pious, keep your opinions to yourself, and pop out healthy male children like a royal vending machine. If you couldn't, well, you'd better have a good head on your shoulders while you still had one. In the chapters ahead, we'll meet each of the 6 women who entered this gilded meat grinder. Some thought they were in a fairy tale. Others probably heard the rumours and just crossed their fingers. All of them learned the hard way that marrying Henry VIII wasn't just a royal duty. It was a gamble with your life, your legacy, and your neck. So buckle up, because next we meet Catherine of Aragon, the first contestant on Wheel of Matrimony, Tudor edition. Before she was the Queen of England, or the first unfortunate soul in Henry VIII's matrimonial hit parade, Catherine of Aragon was royalty in her own right. Born in 1485 to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. Yes, that Ferdinand and Isabella who funded Columbus's misadventure. Catherine was practically raised with a crown on her head and political duty in her baby bottle. She was a princess with a purpose. Marry well, unite kingdoms, and ideally not end up in a Tudor soap opera. Her first English husband was not Henry, but rather his older brother Prince Arthur, the original heir to the throne. At age 15, she sailed across the stormy English Channel to meet her betrothed, a skinny, sickly boy whose name sounded noble, but whose health resembled a wet sack of turnips. The marriage lasted about 5 months before Arthur did what so many people in Tudor England did when the wind changed direction. He died. Now, this might seem like the end of Catherine's royal English adventure, but no, this is Tudor England, where no one lets a good dowry go to waste. So after years of awkward limbo, negotiations and papal paperwork, she was recycled into the arms of young Henry VIII, who at the time was a charming prince with a full head of hair and no idea he'd one day turn into a paranoid leg-wounded megalomaniac. Catherine, by now in her early 20s, married Henry in 1509, and the people of England adored her. She was intelligent, devout, elegant, fluent in Latin, and she actually knew how to rule. For the next 2 decades, Catherine wasn't just a queen, she was the queen. She gave birth several times, but only one child survived. A daughter, Mary, future Queen of England and professional mood killer. Meanwhile, Henry paced the palace like a man trying to return a shirt he didn't like but couldn't find the receipt for. You see, Catherine wasn't just a good wife. She was too good. She was too respected to discard easily, too politically important to offend, too regal to humiliate at first. But as the years rolled by, Catherine's one major failing, according to Henry, anyway, became glaring. No living sons. Just a whole lot of disappointment, miscarriages, and dead babies, which was tragically common for the era, but utterly unacceptable for a man who believed his manliness was directly proportional to the number of Y chromosomes in the room. And so began Henry's descent into divine drama. Convinced that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow, a technical biblical no-no, he started lobbying the Pope for an annulment, basically arguing that the marriage had never been valid in the first place, which was awkward, because the Pope had already signed off on it 20 years ago, and undoing it now would have made the Church look about as consistent as Henry's loyalty. Now here's where things get wild. When the Pope, stuck between Henry and Catherine's extremely Catholic nephew Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, refused to play divorce lawyer, Henry decided, very maturely, to break up with the entire Church instead. That's right. Catherine was dumped so hard, it created an entirely new branch of Christianity. It's the 16th century version of being unfollowed so hard, someone invents a new social media platform just to spite you. Thus was born the Church of England, Henry's personal spiritual side project, where the main tenet was Henry gets what Henry wants. He declared himself the supreme head of the Church, because why not? Hired some yes-men with religious robes, and told the Pope to take a flying leap. Catherine, however, refused to go quietly. She never accepted the annulment. She never believed herself anything but Henry's true wife. She signed letters as queen until the day she died, and when Henry tried to strong-arm her into stepping down, she answered with the dignity of someone who knew her worth. She fought for her title, her daughter's legitimacy, and her reputation, even as Henry banished her to a drafty, far-off castle with servants who were told to call her Princess Dowager a title as cold and insulting as the stone walls around her. Catherine's final years were spent in forced isolation, writing letters and praying while her health deteriorated. She died in 1536, likely of cancer, still firm in her belief that she was Henry's rightful wife. And let's be honest, history kind of agrees with her. When you reign for over 2 decades and keep the kingdom stable while your husband's off jousting and writing bad poetry, you earn your crown, even if your husband tries to rip it away. Catherine of Aragon wasn't just the first wife. She was the benchmark. Every woman who followed lived in her shadow, haunted by her dignity, her devotion, and the absolute mess Henry made, trying to replace her. She came to England, a princess, ruled like a queen, and exited like a saint. Meanwhile, Henry was just getting started. Next up, a woman who flirted her way into the crown and lost her head trying to keep it. Anne Boleyn, flirting with disaster and literally everyone at court. If Catherine of Aragon was the patient queen who got ghosted, Anne Boleyn was the magnetic interloper who rewrote the script and then got cut out of the show. Literally, she was clever, controversial, charismatic, and in the eyes of Henry VIII, irresistible. For a while, Anne wasn't born a queen. Far from it. She was born to an ambitious, noble family, with a decent pedigree, but no direct line to the throne. Her early life took her through the glittering courts of the Netherlands and France, where she picked up all the continental sophistication of a Renaissance girl: wit, style, language, music, and the very useful ability to hold a room's attention without saying a word. She was not your average simpering court lady. She had presence. By the time she returned to England and joined Queen Catherine's household, she was already well versed in court politics and very aware of the dangerous game that was royal flirtation. Her sister Mary Boleyn had already had a fling with King Henry, but Anne wasn't interested in being a side piece. She wanted the whole throne, and here's where things got spicy. Henry was smitten, not just attracted, obsessed. But Anne wasn't giving it up for royal giggles. No, she knew her worth. She said, "If you want me, your majesty, you better put a ring on it." Beyoncé would have approved. Now, picture this. Henry is still married. Divorce is still illegal. The Pope is still ignoring Henry's texts. But Anne, she's standing there like the plot twist in a historical soap opera, promising Henry sons and satisfaction if he could just get rid of the current wife. In a move that could be described as romantic, if it weren't also political heresy, Henry tore England out of the Catholic Church for Anne, the spiritual equivalent of getting a full tattoo of your girlfriend's face before the first date. When Catherine was finally pushed out and Anne crowned queen in 1533, it wasn't subtle. She was pregnant, heavily so, and everyone was watching her belly like it was a royal crystal ball. If it popped out a boy, Anne would be validated. If not, well, Tudor England was about as forgiving as a drunk badger with a grudge. The baby was born. It was a girl, Elizabeth. Yes, that Elizabeth, the one who would later become one of England's greatest monarchs. But back in 1533, she may as well have been born with a sign reading, "You had one job, Anne." Henry started to cool. The long chase was over, and the thrilling mistress had become the anxious, politically fragile wife. Anne was no fool. She knew her position was balanced on a razor's edge, and so she did what many in her shoes would have done. She tried again and again. Miscarriages, stillbirths. The pattern was tragically familiar. But unlike Catherine, Anne had enemies who were eager to exploit every failed pregnancy and every snide remark. Because, make no mistake, Anne was not universally loved. She was seen as a usurper, a temptress, a schemer. Nobles loyal to Catherine loathed her. Religious conservatives blamed her for the country's break from Rome. Even members of Henry's own court, some of whom Anne had personally humiliated or outmaneuvered, were sharpening their daggers behind polite smiles. By 1536, things took a very dark turn. Henry had already grown distant, and Anne's latest miscarriage, believed to have been a male child, was the final straw. Suddenly, Henry decided this marriage, too, had been a mistake. But this time, he didn't just want an annulment, he wanted scorched earth. Enter the charges. Anne was arrested and accused of adultery, with multiple men, including her own brother George Boleyn. Yes, they threw incest into the pot, because apparently treason alone wasn't scandalous enough. The idea that the Queen of England constantly under guard and watched like a hawk, managed to conduct a royal orgy in her spare time, is laughable, unless you were living in Tudor England, in which case people were nodding like it made total sense. Her trial was a circus. Evidence was flimsy, witnesses were coerced, and the verdict was a foregone conclusion. She was found guilty of adultery, incest, and high treason. The punishment? Death by beheading. But hey, silver lining, she got a sword instead of an axe, which was considered more dignified. Tudor chivalry, everybody. On May 19th, 1536, Anne, dressed in elegant robes of crimson and grey, walked calmly to the scaffold and gave one of the most graceful final speeches in royal history, praising the very king who ordered her death. That's not loyalty, that's survival strategy, all the way to the bitter end. Anne Boleyn was not just a queen, she was a political revolution in heels. She shattered norms, split kingdoms, and made Henry bend the rules of religion and royalty for her. And yet, she ended up headless at 35, with a reputation so mangled it took centuries to repair. The real irony. Her daughter, the girl everyone saw as a disappointment, would grow up to rule England for 45 years, usher in a golden age, and make Boleyn a name history couldn't ignore if it tried. Anne wasn't just the other woman. She was a force of nature who dared to be intelligent, ambitious, and interesting, in a time when those traits got you either coronated or executed. Next up, a woman who saw all of this and still said, "Sure, I'll marry him." Jane Seymour, the quiet one who did the one thing no one else could. If Anne Boleyn was fire and ambition, Jane Seymour was warm porridge with a halo, which, in Tudor England, was exactly what King Henry VIII was looking for. After years of volatile queens and church-exploding scandals, Jane came along like a medieval sigh of relief. She wasn't loud, she wasn't political. She didn't rewrite religion, she just quietly waited her turn, and then delivered the one thing no other wife had managed to give Henry a son. Let's start at the beginning. Jane was born into a noble family, but nothing about her early life screamed future queen. She wasn't known for her dazzling wit, sultry charm, or intellectual sparring. In fact, her education was fairly modest. She could read and write a bit, but she excelled more in needlework than in philosophy. In short, Jane was about as spicy as a soggy meat pie, and in Henry's eyes, that was deliciously refreshing. She joined court as a lady-in-waiting, first to Catherine of Aragon, and then to Anne Boleyn, a career trajectory that reads like the opening credits to a very bloody soap opera. But she was shrewd. Jane watched. Jane waited. Jane did not flirt. Instead, she let Henry come to her, and when he did, in the final crumbling months of Anne Boleyn's reign, she played the part of the perfect contrast, obedient, devout, and crucially, not currently on trial for incest. When Anne's head hit the straw in May 1536, Henry married Jane just 11 days later. You could still smell the execution smoke at the wedding feast. But let's be clear, Jane didn't exactly marry for love, and Henry wasn't handing out hugs and flowers. The throne was dangerous real estate, and Jane knew it. But in a court where smiling too brightly could be considered treasonous seduction, she managed to navigate the spotlight with near-invisible grace. Henry adored her, or at least, he adored the idea of her. Jane didn't challenge him, didn't criticize him, didn't remind him of ex-wives or papal disputes, and the moment she got pregnant, she was treated like a walking national emergency. No pressure, Jane, just carry the hopes of an entire dynasty inside your uterus. And oh, did she deliver. On October 12th, 1537, after 2 long days of brutal labour, Jane gave birth to Edward VI, the longed-for male heir, who promptly made Henry weep with joy and plan massive christenings. England rejoiced, trumpets blared, people toasted. Henry could finally stop looking at his family tree like it owed him money. But Jane didn't do so well. She was weak, feverish, and in the days following Edward's birth, her health collapsed. Childbirth in the 1500s was less beautiful miracle of life, and more, let's hope she doesn't explode. Sanitation? Non-existent. Infection? Inevitable. Jane likely suffered from puerperal fever, a bacterial infection that had a nasty habit of turning celebrations into funerals within a week. And sure enough, just 12 days after giving birth to the future king, Jane died. The irony? Her death secured her legacy more than her life ever could. because now, in Henry's mind, she was perfect. She hadn't lived long enough to argue with him. She hadn't failed to produce sons. She hadn't sided with any annoying religious factions or tried to execute his favourite courtiers. Jane was frozen in time as the ideal wife, and Henry never let anyone forget it. He dressed in mourning. He took his time before marrying again, a whole 2 years, which in Henry time is practically celibacy. He even had Jane buried next to him in St. George's Chapel, the only one of his wives to get that dubious honour. It was romantic. If your definition of romance includes being remembered primarily for dying well, Jane's posthumous pedestal became a permanent fixture in Henry's narrative. Any time future wives caused problems, and oh boy, they would, he'd sigh and mumble something about dear Jane and how none of them measured up to her sweet, silent perfection, which, let's be honest, was less about Jane and more about Henry's need for less drama. But don't let the soft image fool you. Jane wasn't just a passive footnote. She subtly advocated for the restoration of Mary, Henry's daughter, by Catherine of Aragon, who had been declared illegitimate. She did it gently, not with declarations, but with quiet persistence. And while she didn't live long enough to change much, she proved that being underestimated could sometimes be a tactical advantage. For a moment, she held the most powerful position in England, and she wielded it with just enough restraint to survive childbirth, but not its aftermath. In the end, Jane won the Tudor lottery. She gave Henry a son, then died before she could disappoint him. Coming up next, a wife who didn't exactly win the lottery. In fact, she was more like the unfortunate prize in a royal blind date. Anne of Cleves, the one who survived by being too boring to execute. If you've ever gone on a blind date, only to realize the profile picture was taken in 2008 under extremely forgiving lighting, then congratulations. You already understand the tragedy of Anne of Cleves. Except instead of an awkward dinner, Anne got an entire kingdom's worth of awkward, because this wasn't just a mismatch. This was royal catfishing, 16th century style. Let's set the scene. It's late 1539. Henry VIII is aging, increasingly paranoid, fresh off the emotional roller coaster of Jane Seymour's death, and looking for wife #4. Europe's a political jigsaw puzzle, and Henry's trying to glue together a Protestant alliance. Enter Anne of Cleves, the German Duchess, with a powerful brother, Protestant credentials, and allegedly a face that could launch 1,000 ships, or at least one unhappy marriage. To size up the merchandise, Henry sends his favourite Renaissance hype man, Hans Holbein, to paint Anne's portrait. The resulting image is flattering, maybe a little too flattering. Let's just say Holbein either had a magic paintbrush or a serious side hustle in Tudor Photoshop, because when Anne arrived in England, Henry was not impressed. According to one account, Henry first laid eyes on her in disguise, hoping for a romantic gotcha moment, like in a rom-com. But instead of fireworks, he looked at her and reportedly muttered something along the lines of, "I like her not," which in royal matchmaking terms is about the same as swiping left so hard you break your phone. She showed up thinking she'd be queen. He looked at her like she was a soggy meat pie, but duty called. The wedding still went ahead in January 1540, even though Henry reportedly struggled to go through with it, and not just emotionally. He made some very public complaints about Anne's appearance and body odours, which may or may not have been true, but were definitely overshared. This was the Tudor equivalent of leaving a 1-star Yelp review about your spouse. To be fair, Anne wasn't exactly thrilled either. She'd been raised in the stiff, formal courts of Germany, where dancing was optional and smiling was discouraged. She arrived in England with poor English, poor fashion sense by Tudor standards, and absolutely no idea how to flirt with a king. Henry, meanwhile, wanted someone more like a sexy court jester, witty, vivacious, and politically decorative. Anne, she was the human equivalent of an overcooked potato, solid, undramatic, entirely wrong for the role. Still, they gave the marriage a go. Briefly, the union lasted just 6 months, and depending on which account you read, was never consummated. Henry claimed he tried, but things just didn't proceed. He blamed Anne's looks. Anne said nothing, possibly just happy to survive. Honestly, she probably peeked over at the ghosts of Henry's previous wives and thought, "I'll take annulment over decapitation, thanks." By July 1540, the marriage was officially annulled. The grounds? Henry claimed he hadn't been able to complete the marriage due to lack of attraction and prior engagement rumours. Anne, bless her diplomatic heart, didn't argue. She agreed, played the oh gosh, okay card, and gracefully accepted the title of the king's beloved sister. Translation: you're not hot enough to be queen, but you're chill enough to keep around. And here's the kicker. Anne got the best deal out of all Henry's wives. No trial, no execution, no banishment. In fact, she ended up living in wealth and comfort in England, with a generous pension, multiple estates, and the freedom to do literally whatever she wanted. She even got invited back to court from time to time, and stayed on good terms with Henry and his children. She basically won the Tudor divorce sweepstakes. Anne went from queen to cool ex-aunt in record time, and she played her cards brilliantly. When Henry remarried, this time to the much younger Catherine Howard, Anne sent a gift and a polite note, which may have included the 16th century version of good luck. She seems fun. In her later years, Anne lived quietly and comfortably at Hever Castle, ironically the childhood home of Anne Boleyn, enjoying zero political drama, good food, and the kind of retirement most ex-royals could only dream of. She even outlived Henry and 4 of his 6 wives, dying peacefully in 1557, a rare feat for any woman linked romantically to Henry VIII. So was she the plain, dull disappointment Henry claimed she was? Not really. Anne was smart, savvy, and played a dangerous game with unflinching grace. She recognized the ticking time bomb she had married, and stepped out of the blast zone with all her limbs and dignity intact. If marriage to Henry VIII was a game of survival, asterisk, Anne didn't just survive. She quietly won, all while being considered too boring to keep. There's something kind of poetic about that. Next up, someone who was not so lucky, Catherine Howard, the teenage queen, and the speed run to execution. Catherine Howard, the Tudor queen, who proved that being young, pretty, and fun at court is great, unless you marry a paranoid 49-year-old king who just beheaded his last interesting wife. In that case, maybe don't flirt with half the palace. Let's back up. Catherine Howard wasn't born with a crown in mind. She was the daughter of a younger son of a duke, which in Tudor terms meant noble, but broke. She was raised in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, in what can generously be described as a boarding school, where nobody watched the kids. Imagine a Tudor version of a frat house, but with less hygiene and more lute music. That's where Catherine got her early education, in more ways than one. While her cousin Anne Boleyn had sharpened her political and flirtation skills in the courts of Europe, Catherine's resume included dancing, giggling, and sneaking around with music teachers. But what she lacked in formal training, she made up for in charm. She was vivacious, bubbly, and had that fun party girl energy, the kind that makes people forgive you for not knowing what Latin is. So how did this carefree teenager end up married to Henry VIII, a man who was twice her age, twice her weight, and already twice widowed and twice divorced? Well, Henry was going through a full-blown midlife crisis. His health was failing. He had a stinking ulcerated leg wound that no one was brave enough to mention, and his last wife, Anne of Cleves, hadn't exactly rocked his world. So when he saw Catherine dancing at court, young, flirtatious, and very much alive, he fell hard. And by fell, we mean he proposed with all the subtlety of a cannon blast. To Catherine, this was her ticket to the top. She was plucked from relative obscurity and crowned queen at about 17. Sounds like a dream, right? Except this dream came with a very cranky, very suspicious, very Henry VIII-shaped nightmare attached. She thought she was in a romance novel. Turns out it was a murder mystery. Catherine wasn't exactly ready to play the dutiful queen. She wanted to dance, laugh, and maybe flirt a little. Or, in her case, a lot. She quickly gathered a clique of favourites at court, including Thomas Culpeper, a handsome gentleman of the King's Chamber, and Francis Derham, an old flame who may or may not have expected some back pay affection now that she was royal. The court, ever the hive of whispering bees it was, noticed. The rumours buzzed, and because this was Tudor England, a place where gossip had sharper teeth than policy, it didn't take long for word of her alleged indiscretions to reach Henry. But Henry, he was besotted. If for a while he was blind to it all, he called Catherine his rose without a thorn, which sounds romantic until you realize he also said that about Anne Boleyn, right before he personally signed her death warrant. Romantic consistency, not his strong suit. Eventually, the accusations piled up. Catherine had not only had lovers before the king, scandalous enough in itself, but may have continued seeing one after becoming queen. In any modern workplace, this might result in a stern HR meeting. In Tudor England, it meant you were probably going to die. What followed was a brutal unravelling. Catherine was arrested and questioned. Under pressure, and quite possibly terrified out of her mind, she confessed to her past relationship with Derham. But the crown wasn't satisfied with past. It needed present sin, something juicy enough to justify execution. That's where Thomas Culpeper came in. Letters between the two surfaced, full of affection and longing. Catherine insisted nothing happened, and to this day historians debate whether the affair ever crossed into physical territory. But Henry, who had always feared betrayal more than battle, didn't need hard proof. Suspicion was enough. Catherine was stripped of her title, imprisoned, and most cruelly, forced to watch Culpeper and Derham get executed first. One was beheaded, the other was hanged, drawn, and quartered, which is not, as it sounds, a fun Tudor pub game. By the time Catherine was led to the block in February 1542, she was about 19 years old. According to legend, which may or may not be romantic embellishment, she practiced laying her head on the chopping block the night before to ensure she'd do it gracefully. Her final words were allegedly, "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." Whether that's true or just historical drama, it sums up her short, bright, and doomed life. Catherine Howard was a teenager thrust into a deadly game she was never trained to play. She was impulsive, naive, and tragically unprepared for the shark tank that was the Tudor court. But above all, she was a reminder that in Henry's world, even love had to be state-approved, or else. Next chapter, get ready for Catherine Parr, the only wife who managed to marry Henry and outlive him, without needing a sword-proof collar. And now, ladies and gentlemen, presenting the rarest creature of all, a wife of Henry VIII, who actually survived the marriage. Meet Catherine Parr, queen, scholar, caregiver, Protestant dabbler, and possessor of the world's most politely exhausted sigh when Henry finally dropped dead. Let's be clear, by the time Catherine Parr showed up, Henry VIII was not what you'd call a catch. He was bloated, pus-filled, paranoid, and married more times than a Vegas Elvis impersonator. And yet, despite all this, Catherine, intelligent, poised, and already widowed twice, agreed to become his sixth wife. Why? Well, turning down the king wasn't exactly an option, especially when said king had a bad habit of solving marital problems with a headsman. But Catherine wasn't just some terrified wallflower with a prayer book. She was educated, politically aware, and unusually for the time, especially in Tudor marriage roulette. She could read, write, and argue theology like a boss. She didn't just survive Henry, she outsmarted him, outlived him, and probably sighed in relief the day he croaked. Catherine had already experienced life as a dutiful, noble wife, twice over, before catching Henry's eye. Her first husband was much older classic, and her second wasn't around long enough to annoy her. By the time she entered court circles, she was a savvy widow, mature, calm, and most importantly for Henry, not scandalous. After the mess with Catherine Howard, he was clearly in the market for a less flirty model, someone maternal, someone who could hold a spoon and a Bible. And Catherine delivered. As queen, she essentially became Henry's full-time nurse, part-time stepmother, and occasional theological sparring partner, which is not a combo you'll find on most dating apps. Seriously, she cared for Henry's infected leg ulcers, endured his moods, and even brought his fractured royal family back together. She reunited Henry with his daughters Mary and Elizabeth, smoothing over years of dynastic drama with a level of grace and diplomacy that could have qualified her for a United Nations gig, had it existed. But she didn't stop at band-aids and babysitting. Catherine was also a passionate advocate of religious reform, a dangerous position at a time when suggesting the Pope had a few flaws could land you in the tower. She surrounded herself with Protestant scholars, published religious texts under her own name, and even tried to nudge Henry toward more reformist thinking, which, predictably, almost got her executed. Yes, despite all the nursing and niceties, Catherine made the mistake of being intellectually confident around a man who'd already executed 2 wives for less. Some members of Henry's court, always looking for ways to score points or eliminate rivals, whispered that Catherine's theological debates weren't just cute little pillow talks but full-blown heresy. One particularly eager group of conservative nobles cooked up a plan to arrest her for religious treason. But Catherine was no fool. When she got wind of the plot, she didn't double down or run. Instead, she pulled a masterclass in survival. The next time she was in front of Henry, she played the humble card to perfection, claiming she never meant to instruct the king, only to distract him from his ailments with pleasant conversation. "Oh no, my lord," she probably cooed. "I don't think, I merely echo your wisdom." Henry, naturally loving to be flattered like a Renaissance peacock, forgave her on the spot and tore up the arrest warrant. Imagine dodging death by complimenting your husband's theological opinions. That's not marriage, that's a James Bond-level maneuver. When Henry finally died in 1547, Catherine probably felt the same thing we all do after a terrible group project ends, grateful, exhausted, and in desperate need of wine. But she didn't disappear into retirement. She quickly remarried to Thomas Seymour, a charming but reckless nobleman, and the brother of Jane Seymour. It was a bit of a scandal after all. She married just months after Henry's death. But Catherine had spent the better part of her life being married off like a chess piece. This time she chose for herself. The marriage to Seymour was passionate, but problematic. He was ambitious, unstable, and flirted shamelessly with her stepdaughter, Princess Elizabeth. Yes, that Elizabeth. Catherine, ever the pragmatist, mostly ignored the drama. She was finally pregnant, for the first time, at age 36. Sadly, the story doesn't end on a high note. After giving birth to a daughter named Mary, Catherine died of postpartum complications just 6 days later. It was a tragic end for someone who had spent so much of her life navigating danger with grace. But make no mistake, Catherine Parr was a trailblazer. She was the first Queen of England to publish a book under her own name, the first to serve as regent while Henry was away at war, and the only one to walk away from the whole mess with her head still firmly attached. Her life was a balancing act of intellect, diplomacy, and courage in the most politically radioactive court in Europe. She didn't just survive, she thrived in a palace where thriving usually meant you hadn't been poisoned that morning. And when history closed the book on Henry's bloody love life, Catherine Parr was still standing, probably muttering something like, "That man was lucky I didn't smother him in his sleep." Being queen sounds glamorous, right? Jewels, gowns, castles, people curtsying every time you blink. Now remove the fun parts. Add daily espionage, a ticking fertility clock, constant pressure to smile through internal screaming, and a king with executioner-level mood swings. Congratulations, you're queen in Henry VIII's court, the most high-stakes role in Tudor England that didn't involve jousting or plague surgery. Let's start with the daily grind. Queens didn't get to lie around nibbling grapes while being serenaded. No, being queen under Henry meant an exhausting schedule of ceremonial obligations, political theatre, and being treated like a walking womb in designer silk. Your day might start with mass, then slide into hours of courtly appearances, managing the royal household, a sprawling network of hundreds of staff, overseeing charitable duties, enduring small talk with ambassadors who all looked like they'd fought a bear, and ending with trying to guess whether your husband wanted a kiss goodnight or a new wife. Pageantry was relentless. You had to attend banquets, feasts, dances, religious processions, and whatever other glittering distractions the court came up with to keep noble egos inflated. You had to smile like a diplomat, bow like a ballerina, and keep your cool when Lady So-and-so from Norfolk spilled wine on your embroidered sleeves for the 3rd time. Every twitch of your eyebrow was political. Every choice of brooch was open to interpretation. And God help you if you wore Spanish silk when French velvet was in. Being queen wasn't glamorous. It was like being in a high-stakes cooking show where the judges are moody and failure means actual death. But the biggest job, and the most brutal, was producing a male heir. What queens were expected to bake a prince in 9 months or less. And if you didn't, well, let's just say Tudor maternity leave came with a guillotine clause. The stakes weren't just dynastic, they were existential. Women didn't control the narrative. If you gave birth to a girl, you failed. If the baby died, you failed. If you miscarried, you were suspicious. If you had no children at all, you were definitely cursed. Basically, you were one bad period away from the royal doghouse, or worse, the executioner's block. And if you thought that stress was manageable, add in court politics, an environment so toxic, it made cobra pits look like vacation spas. Everyone had an agenda. Courtiers whispered in corners, servants carried secrets like silver trays, and your ladies-in-waiting were half friends, half spies. You were surrounded by people who might kneel in the morning and denounce you by sunset. Trust was a luxury queens couldn't afford. Henry changed favourites faster than he changed wives. One moment, your ally was in charge of the Privy Council. The next, he was being dragged to the Tower for treason because someone heard him cough during a sermon. The only consistent rule of Henry's court was don't blink. And then there was Henry himself. In the early days, he was charismatic, athletic, and charming. By the mid-reign, he was bloated, paranoid, and unpredictable. Being married to Henry was like being handcuffed to a royal thundercloud. You never knew if today was kisses or execution orders. He wrote poetry, yes, but he also rewrote laws so he could legally murder you if your smile looked sarcastic. Queens were figureheads, not rulers. You had influence, yes, but mostly in private. Publicly, your job was to look divine and say nothing inflammatory. You were expected to play hostess, mother, pious woman, and submissive consort, often all in the same breath. And if you had opinions, tread carefully. Too much intellectual spark could label you a heretic. Too little, and you were boring, or unsuitable for court. Imagine being judged simultaneously for thinking too much and not enough. And that's before breakfast. Emotionally, the toll was massive. Some queens aged 10 years in 2. Others grew anxious, withdrawn, or obsessively religious. Living in Henry's court was like living under a guillotine made of expectations. You were always on display, always performing, and always, a heartbeat away from being replaced, imprisoned, or worse. The crown wasn't heavy with gold. It was heavy with fear, duty, and the ghosts of queens who came before you. You walked past tapestries and portraits knowing half the women in them were either dead or disgraced, and all of them once thought they would be the one to fix Henry. But here's the real kicker. There were no safe zones. Even when the king wasn't angry at you, someone else was plotting your fall. The court was a chessboard, and you were the queen. Powerful, yes, but always one diagonal move away from being taken off the board. So why did women accept the role? Because, in a world where a noble woman's options were limited to marriage, convent, or obscure countryside obscurity, becoming queen offered power, legacy, and prestige, even if the risks made Russian roulette look like a tea party. In short, being queen in Henry VIII's court was like being in a game of Survivor. But everyone's armed, everyone's jealous, and the host occasionally executes the contestants. And the prize, a crown, a closet full of silk gowns, and if you're lucky, survival. Just don't get too comfortable. Henry's got that look in his eye again, and the next hopeful bride is already picking out her coronation dress. Henry's midlife crisis was legendary. Not the kind where you buy a sports car or get a tattoo, but the kind where you rewrite the religious landscape of a whole country, dissolve centuries-old alliances, and marry 6 women, 3 of whom ended up dead, and that's just the start. Let's unpack this slow descent from golden prince to royal roller coaster, from athlete to angry ham. In his youth, Henry was everything a Renaissance prince should be: handsome, athletic, musical, and charming. He could dance, sing, and beat anyone at a wrestling match. Probably because he was very tall, very strong, and had zero shame. The kind of guy who made you think, yeah, that guy would be great at a medieval Tinder date. But by his mid-30s, things started to change. Henry developed gout, a painful joint condition brought on by too much rich food, wine, and probably stress from managing the most powerful kingdom in Europe. Gout is not just painful, it makes you limp, swell up, and sometimes scream in agony, while surrounded by sycophants who nervously ask if you want more pudding. And that's exactly what happened. The once energetic king was now hobbling around the palace like an angry, puffy sausage. Paranoia sets in. As Henry's health declined, so did his trust in others. Remember, he was a king surrounded by courtiers who were just as likely to be friends as they were to be plotting his downfall. That paranoia grew to such extremes that by the 1530s and 1540s, Henry's court was essentially a madhouse. Spies were everywhere. People were arrested on the flimsiest accusations. Even his own advisors worried about stepping on the wrong toe because one false move could be labelled treason. Each wife had to navigate a new Henry, sometimes charming and romantic, sometimes suspicious and brutal. The Henry who would happily dance with Anne Boleyn was not the Henry who would later watch her beheaded. The Henry who kissed Catherine Parr goodbye was not the Henry who'd ordered Catherine Howard's execution months earlier. The evolution of Henry's marital madness. The 6 wives weren't just unlucky for their personal reasons, they were unlucky because Henry himself was changing, dramatically. Catherine of Aragon was queen. When Henry was still vigorous and hopeful about a male heir, she endured years of being loved but ultimately rejected, as Henry's obsession with a son consumed him. Anne Boleyn arrived, when Henry was hungry for excitement and a new religious order, but her fate was sealed when Henry's charm turned into ruthless paranoia. Jane Seymour was the quiet calm after the storm. Henry saw her as the perfect wife, fertile, obedient, and quiet. Sadly, that perfect match lasted just long enough to give Henry a son before she died. Anne of Cleves arrived during a period when Henry's health was declining, his eyesight and judgment worse than his gout. He famously catfished himself by agreeing to marry a woman based on a flattering portrait, only to be disappointed in person. The marriage was annulled so quickly it barely counted. Catherine Howard, the teenage bride, came at a time when Henry was an aging man desperate for youth and beauty to revive his spirits. Her fatal mistakes were compounded by Henry's suspicious and vindictive streak. Finally, Catherine Parr, the smart, well-read survivor, was married to a man who was physically declining, but still wielding the power of life and death with an iron fist. She managed to outlive him by being clever and careful. Erratic decisions, and why they mattered. Henry's decisions in his later years were impulsive and frankly bonkers at times. He broke from the Catholic Church because he wanted a divorce. He declared himself the head of the Church of England because the Pope said no. He married several times, annulled marriages on whims, and executed wives and advisors almost as a hobby. This wasn't just personal drama. Henry's midlife crisis reshaped England forever. Religious institutions crumbled and rebuilt. Nobles switched loyalties like they were at a market. And the common folk? They probably just wanted Henry to stop yelling and eat less. By the end, Henry's court was less a royal palace, and more a revolving door of nobles trying to guess which way the wind blew, because that wind was Henry's temper, health, and increasingly questionable judgment. The human side of the tyrant. Despite the humour and historical facts, there's a tragic human story here too. Henry was a man grappling with illness, loneliness, the burden of kingship, and the desperate desire to leave a legacy. His paranoia and cruelty came from fear, the fear of losing power, legacy, and perhaps even himself. And unfortunately for the 6 wives, they were caught in the middle of this storm. Each one dealt with a different version of Henry, the charming lover, the desperate father, the paranoid king, the old man grappling with pain. They weren't just spouses, they were royal survivors, navigating a shifting, dangerous landscape where the only constant was uncertainty. So by the end of it all, Henry was less golden prince and more angry ham with a crown. A king who went from smashing tennis balls to smashing heads, from writing love poems to signing execution warrants, from dazzling Europe to dismantling his own kingdom's faith, all in the throes of a historic midlife meltdown. And all 6 wives, well, they were the reluctant players in the greatest royal soap opera Tudor England ever saw. After all the drama, heartbreak, and head-chopping, you might wonder, did these 6 remarkable women leave any real mark on history? Or were they just tragic figures tossed around like royal chess pieces? Spoiler alert, their legacies are huge, politically, religiously, culturally, and their stories have shaped the way we think about queens, power, and even relationships today. Each wife played a role in the seismic shifts happening in 16th century England, and their influence stretched far beyond the royal bedroom. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first queen, was the daughter of the mighty Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. Her marriage to Henry originally symbolized an important alliance between England and Spain, a power play in the chess game of European politics. When Henry sought to annul their marriage, it sparked the English Reformation, arguably one of the biggest political religious upheavals in Western history. The Pope's refusal to grant the annulment led Henry to break with Rome and declare himself the head of the Church of England, setting England on a course away from Catholicism and toward Protestantism. Anne Boleyn was a key figure in this religious revolution. Her refusal to be just another royal consort made her a catalyst for change, and her daughter Elizabeth I would grow up to be one of England's greatest monarchs, stabilizing the nation after years of religious turmoil. Jane Seymour, though queen for a brief time, gave Henry the son he so desperately wanted. Edward VI, whose reign continued the Protestant reforms. Anne of Cleves brought political alliances with German states into play, showing Henry's attempts at diplomacy, even if his judgment was questionable. Catherine Howard, young and impulsive, was a reminder of the dangers of court intrigue and how fragile a queen's position really was. Catherine Parr, the survivor, was a champion of education and religious reform. She helped influence Henry's children and promoted the spread of Protestant ideas. Collectively, these women influenced the future of England's monarchy and religion in profound ways. The repercussions of their lives and marriages ripple through history to this day. The children of Henry's wives weren't just heirs to the throne, they were the architects of England's destiny. Mary, a daughter of Catherine of Aragon, famously earned the nickname Bloody Mary for her attempt to restore Catholicism in England through harsh persecution of Protestants. Her reign was turbulent but important, as it represented the fierce religious divisions that defined Tudor England. Elizabeth I, Anne Boleyn's daughter, became one of the most celebrated monarchs in English history. Known as the Virgin Queen, she skillfully balanced religious factions, defeated the Spanish Armada, and ushered in the Elizabethan Golden Age of literature and exploration. Edward VI, Jane Seymour's son, ascended to the throne as a boy king and aggressively pushed England further into Protestantism before his untimely death. The legacies of these children alone show that Henry's wives weren't just footnotes. Their bloodlines shaped England's future for centuries. Fast forward to today, and the Six Wives have become cultural icons far beyond dusty history books. Musicals like Six turn their stories into catchy pop anthems, rewriting history with sass and modern flair. Each wife gets her moment to shine, from Catherine of Aragon's dignity to Catherine Parr's savvy. TV shows like The Tudors dramatize their lives with all the intrigue, romance and betrayal you could want, plus some historically questionable but highly entertaining scenes. Even memes and social media jokes keep the Six Wives alive in the public imagination. You'll find them captioned with snarky one-liners, modern comparisons, and endless divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived references, a mnemonic that's as catchy as it is grim. The fascination comes from more than just their tragic ends. It's because their stories resonate. They were women navigating impossible circumstances, wielding whatever power they could, and surviving or not in a ruthless world. The Six Wives' experiences offer lessons beyond Tudor history. They show the dangers of absolute power and the human cost of political and personal ambition. Their stories highlight how women's voices and agency were often crushed under patriarchal rule, yet how they still found ways to influence history. They remind us that behind every famous man, there are women whose lives shape the course of history in ways often overlooked. And honestly, they're just endlessly fascinating. From royal intrigue to romance gone wrong, their lives read like a mix of a soap opera, a thriller, and a tragedy. So the Six Wives didn't just survive to be history footnotes. They became icons of survival, scandal, and how not to choose a husband. Each queen brought her own strength, flaws, and drama to the Tudor court, and left a legacy that still sparks fascination, debate, and yes, plenty of memes. Next time you hear the rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, remember, behind that catchy line are stories of real women who changed history forever, often at great personal cost. Now we'll explore a few great inventions that changed history. The printing press, Ward, how to annoy the church with paper before the printing press. Books were a luxury item. Think Gucci bag, but made of parchment and gilt. If you wanted a copy of anything, the Bible, Aristotle, or even a really good bread recipe, someone had to sit down and write it all out by hand. That someone was usually a monk, hunched over a candle-lit desk, squinting through the dark ages, while contemplating whether he'd ever finish copying psalms before going blind. One book could take months or even years to reproduce, and the ink, it smudged. The paper, it was parchment, meaning sheep got turned into pages more often than into dinner. Reading was for the wealthy, the powerful, or the holy, and if you weren't one of those, your best shot at education was listening to sermons and hoping your Latin was better than your neighbour's. Then along came Johannes Gutenberg, a German goldsmith, who decided that writing books by hand was a medieval nightmare, and there had to be a better way. Around 1440, he introduced the movable type printing press, a Frankenstein's monster of existing technologies. Screw presses from winemaking, oil-based ink, and metal letters you could arrange and reuse. It was the greatest innovation in information since the invention of language itself. And just like any good invention, it terrified the people in charge. Gutenberg's invention was like handing a megaphone to every medieval nerd. Suddenly, knowledge was no longer chained, literally, to library walls. Books could be mass-produced. Literacy rates began to rise. Education expanded beyond monasteries, and people started asking very inconvenient questions. What kind of questions? Well, when the first major book Gutenberg printed was the Bible, that should have been the tip-off. People could now read scripture for themselves, without waiting for a priest to translate it, interpret it, and leave out the uncomfortable bits. The good news? You could finally own a book. The bad news? It was 500 pages of dense medieval Latin and a bonus threat of excommunication. This led to a little historical hiccup called the Reformation, where Martin Luther famously nailed 95 problems to a church door, none of which included poor Wi-Fi, but all of which were helped along by Gutenberg's press. Luther's pamphlets, translated Bibles, and spicy theological takes spread like wildfire. Thanks to printing, you no longer needed to be a cardinal to cause holy chaos. You just needed ink, paper, and a burning desire to rant in German. Books started flying off the presses, not literally, but in medieval terms. It was basically Amazon Prime. Printers popped up in cities across Europe. Venice alone had over 150 printing presses by the year 1500. There were books on science, maps, political ideas, and yes, increasingly scandalous opinions about the Pope. The Renaissance, thank printing. The scientific revolution, printing. The Enlightenment, also printing. Basically, if it involved people learning new things and challenging old ideas, there's a good chance it came out of a press, smelling like fresh ink and academic rebellion. Of course, not all the ideas were good. The printing press didn't just spread knowledge, it also became a launchpad for conspiracy theories, pseudoscience, and that one neighbour's 15-page manifesto about how the moon is a lie. In short, this invention made it possible to spread knowledge, opinions, and conspiracy theories. So basically, it was the original Twitter. And just like Twitter, it quickly became a place where misinformation could be weaponized. Ever heard of the witch craze? Part of its rapid spread across Europe was thanks to pamphlets and manuals printed for aspiring witch hunters. Now you too could burn your neighbours with the confidence of 15 poorly sourced pages backing you up. And what happened to Gutenberg, the man who changed the world? He was sued by his business partner, lost his printing equipment, and died basically broke and forgotten. So in a way, he was the Nikola Tesla of publishing, brilliant, ahead of his time, and financially cursed. It wasn't until later that people realized they owed him pretty much every newspaper, novel, textbook, and BuzzFeed quiz they would ever read. His invention ushered in the age of information, though it took centuries before anyone thought to call it that. To the people living in it, it was just a time when the world got a little louder, a little smarter, and a lot more opinionated. So next time you pick up a book, or more realistically, scroll through an online article while eating cereal, remember, you're standing on the shoulders of monks who used to write 10 hours a day for a single copy, and a guy named Gutenberg who thought, what if we just pressed it? And while he probably never imagined a world of Harry Potter, tabloids and instructional IKEA manuals, he definitely knew one thing. The church said, people reading on their own, what's next? Thinking, fire, humanity's favourite, dangerous best friend. Let's take a brisk walk, or, more likely, a cold, shivering crawl, back in time to several 100,000 years ago, when our distant ancestors were surviving the prehistoric wilderness with little more than sharp sticks, animal skins, and blind optimism. Life was brutal, Food was questionable, and nighttime was less peaceful rest, and more, let's hope a saber-toothed tiger doesn't confuse me for a midnight snack. Then, one fateful day, some bewildered early human rubbed two sticks together, or maybe lightning hit a tree, and fire entered the chat. There was probably a lot of confusion, some awe, definitely some screaming, maybe a little accidental arson. But once the flames settled and someone had the bold idea to wave a half-raw mammoth haunch over it, everything changed. That moment was humanity's first real technological revolution. It didn't require a touchscreen, a Bluetooth connection, or an update that would ruin your week. All it needed was a spark, and some very flammable bad decisions. Fire gave us cooked food, and that meant less chewing and fewer parasites, which back then was basically fine dining. It made meat taste better, roots easier to digest, and bacteria think twice. It was the first time dinner had flavor, warmth, and the added bonus of not trying to kill you on the way down. A grilled rat was now a delicacy, roasted bugs, a treat. Your food could now be seasoned with smoke, and the thrilling sensation of your eyebrows singeing off if you got too close. More than just a stove upgrade, fire became the original home security system. It kept predators away, lit up the night, and allowed groups of humans to gather around it and share stories, ideas, and dramatic reenactments of someone almost catching on fire again. It turned us into social creatures, which is ironic, considering how many modern friendships have been nearly destroyed by one person burning the marshmallows. It also taught us something very important. Fire was useful, but also terrifying. This was nature's glittering warning label that came with no instructions. Fire, nature's way of saying, sure, use me, but only if you're willing to lose your eyebrows. And we did, many times. Every caveman who ever stared in wonder at that first campfire probably had at least one moment of trying to poke it with a stick to see what happens. Spoiler, what happens is a lot of shouting, a scorched loincloth, and the birth of caveman curse words. With fire, humans gained control over light and temperature. Suddenly, they weren't at the mercy of icy nights or pitch-black caves. They could survive colder climates, travel farther, and stay up past sunset. This was the prehistoric version of discovering nightlife. Except instead of drinks and music, it was mammoth stew and someone loudly farting into the flames. And if you're wondering when humans learned to use fire responsibly, they haven't. To this day, fire remains that friend who shows up at your party, brings warmth, sets the mood, and also has a 60% chance of burning down your living room. It powered our first ovens, torches, kilns, and eventually our war machines. It helped us forge weapons, bake bread, and create pottery. And also learn that oops is a word often followed by someone get water. It was both savior and destroyer, heater and hazard. Because while it cooked your meat, it also cooked your hut if you turned your back for 2 minutes. Every early fire user became a reluctant fire marshal. The moment someone nodded off near the flames, another part of the cave became the crispy zone. You didn't just learn how to use fire, you learned how to respect it, like a slightly unhinged dragon you kept as a pet. And of course, no invention is truly complete without changing the world's vocabulary. Thanks to fire, humanity now had an entire language for disaster. The moment fire was discovered, so was the phrase, "What the hell is that smell?" It's no coincidence that every major human breakthrough since fire has included a fire hazard warning. Whether it's steam engines, electrical wiring, or just microwaving aluminum, our relationship with fire remains an awkward romance, full of warmth, passion, and the occasional burnt offering to the gods of why did I think that was a good idea. So next time you sit by a cozy fireplace or light a birthday candle, remember, you are participating in the oldest and most temperamental partnership in history, one that gave us civilization and also taught us how to run around screaming in circles with smoke pouring from our hair, electricity, lightning in a bottle, or how not to fly a kite in a thunderstorm. Picture this, it's the 18th century. People are getting really into powdered wigs, philosophy, and asking big questions like, what is the nature of the universe, and why does touching a doorknob sometimes make me feel like I've been personally betrayed by Zeus? Enter the Enlightenment, that glorious period when everyone decided it was time to get serious about science. by doing extremely unsafe things with static shocks. Electricity wasn't exactly new. Ancient Greeks noticed static electricity when they rubbed amber with fur because of course they did, and a few curious medieval folks tried to store lightning in bottles, usually with results that can best be described as surprising and slightly flammable. But it wasn't until the 1700s that the great minds of Europe decided electricity might be more than just a party trick to scare the dog. Cue Benjamin Franklin, founding father, printer, inventor, philosopher, and amateur human lightning rod. Franklin famously went out during a thunderstorm with a kite, a metal key, and a dream. The dream, to prove lightning was electricity. The reality, a 70% chance of instant cremation. And yet, against all odds and basic survival instincts, he survived. Franklin's experiment gave the world a shocking revelation. Electricity wasn't magic. It was science. Dangerous, crackling, hair-raising science. Franklin proved lightning was electricity, but also proved the phrase, "Don't try this at home," should have been invented earlier. From that moment, the race was on. Scientists across Europe started conducting increasingly zappy experiments, from Alessandro Volta's first battery made of metal and saltwater-soaked cloth, because why not, to Luigi Galvani, who discovered you could make a dead frog's legs twitch with electricity, and then presumably lost sleep for the rest of his life. Electricity became the hot new thing, literally and figuratively. It was mysterious, powerful, and had the kind of unpredictable behavior that made it equally useful and terrifying. But once people figured out how to harness it without setting their pants on fire, the world changed forever. Let's talk light bulbs. Before them, nighttime was basically a countdown to stubbed toes and candle-fueled disasters. Then, along came Thomas Edison, who didn't invent the light bulb. Don't worry, we're not starting that fight, but did perfect a version that didn't burn out in 6 seconds. Suddenly, nights were bright, factories stayed open longer, and people could now read past 6 p.m. without having to squint into a flickering flame. Electricity, because candles are romantic, until you accidentally burn down your entire house. Next came the electric motor, telegraphs, radios, and eventually, the full electrification of cities. Wires stretched like spiderwebs across the globe, homes lit up, streets stopped being death traps after sunset. Life got easier, faster, and slightly more noisy. Then came refrigerators. No more salted meat or questionable milk. People started eating fresh food that didn't try to kill them via fermentation. And then, of course, came the dark side, email. What started as a brilliant method of instant communication has evolved into the modern curse of inbox overload, spam messages from sketchy princes, and 3 a.m. work notifications. Electricity gave us the power to speak across continents, and also made it impossible to ever truly log off. It powered our homes, our gadgets, and our ability to binge-watch questionable TV choices. Electricity is now the silent partner in every aspect of our lives. It runs our hospitals, our schools, our cat videos, and even our toothbrushes. Because if your teeth aren't being cleaned at 3,000 vibrations per minute, are you even living? It's in our cars, our fridges, and that one drawer full of tangled chargers no one wants to sort out. But with great power came great inconvenience. When the electricity goes out, it's instant chaos. People wander around their homes like confused raccoons, opening the fridge as if it will magically fix itself, and lighting candles like it's 1783, and they're about to draft a constitution by candlelight. Modern life without electricity feels like a horror movie where the monster is mild discomfort. And yet, this magical force, the one we now take completely for granted, all started with a guy, a kite, and a death wish. Franklin didn't just bring us electricity, he brought us the beginning of the modern world. He also brought us the uncomfortable realization that flying metal objects in a thunderstorm is, technically, science, but also, possibly, manslaughter. So next time you turn on a lamp, charge your phone, or reheat last night's pizza in a microwave that hums like it's preparing for takeoff, take a moment to thank the wild, weird, and slightly fried minds who got us here. Pasta. Technically, not an invention, but emotionally necessary pasta. It's not electricity. It won't help you read in the dark, power a city, or revolutionize science. But let's be honest, it will make you feel like life is worth living again after a long day of adulting. It's hot, it's comforting, it's flexible, and it's usually covered in enough butter, oil, or cheese to make your doctor sigh audibly. And the best part? It comes in about 600 shapes, all of which taste exactly the same, but are absolutely essential for different sauces. Because food geometry matters. Let's clear up one thing first. Nobody really knows who invented pasta, and that's fine. It's a food so glorious, so universally adored, that claiming credit feels a bit like trying to trademark laughter. The Chinese were making noodles as early as 4,000 years ago. Archaeologists found ancient noodle remains in a sealed bowl, which proves two things. 1. Noodles are old, and 2. People have always forgotten leftovers at the back of the fridge. Meanwhile, over in the Mediterranean, early versions of pasta were also being boiled up, possibly by Arabs, Greeks, or Romans. Basically anyone who looked at flour and water and thought, what if we cooked this into joy? Then there's Marco Polo, the man mythologized for supposedly bringing pasta from China to Italy in the 13th century. While that story's about as historically reliable as a lasagna made with ketchup, it's still widely repeated, possibly because we all want to imagine him dramatically pulling a noodle from his bag like a magician revealing a string of pearls. Whether or not he did, we agree on one thing. Whoever decided, let's add tomato sauce to this, deserves to be canonized as a food saint. Because that's where Italy steps in. If China birthed the noodle, Italy adopted it, gave it a new wardrobe, and raised it to be a global superstar. They didn't just boil it, they shaped it, named it, and created a multi-course national identity around it. From spaghetti, to penne, fusilli, to farfalle, every noodle has a purpose. Some hold sauce, some stab sauce, some hide cheese like delicious little secrets. Pasta, proof that humanity's greatest achievement might just be carbs in different shapes. In fact, Italians take pasta very seriously. Ask a Roman if it's okay to put cheese on seafood pasta, and you might get excommunicated from dinner. Mention breaking spaghetti in half before cooking it. Prepare for the kind of stares usually reserved for criminals. This isn't just food, it's culture, it's pride, it's Nonna's way, or the highway. And pasta's not just an Italian thing anymore. It has gone truly global. Mac and cheese comforts Americans in their time of need. Ramen fuels all-night study sessions and questionable life choices. Pho, though technically not pasta, still counts emotionally because it's soup with noodles and a hug. Pad Thai, stir-fried happiness. Spätzle, German pasta having a midlife identity crisis. Wherever you go, someone has found a way to mix flour and water, boil it, and make it taste like home. This invention doesn't change the world scientifically. It just fills it with garlic, joy, and indigestion. Now, is pasta healthy? Absolutely not. But it feels healthy when you eat it with vegetables, which is how we all justify carbonara for the third night in a row. It's economical. It's fast. It doesn't judge you for eating out of the pot at midnight. Pasta is the friend that always shows up, even when your fridge is empty, except for a suspicious carrot and a haunting jar of mayo. Marco Polo may or may not have brought noodles from China. Either way, he deserves a hug. And sure, pasta hasn't cured disease or powered machines. But can electricity fix a broken heart? Can the printing press help you through a breakup? No, but pasta can. Drenched in butter, doused in cheese, tangled around a fork like it's the world's softest security blanket. It's the edible equivalent of a warm bath and a blanket you don't have to wash. In fact, pasta may be the most democratic food of all. It doesn't care who you are, where you're from, or what your net worth is. If you can boil water and find a jar of sauce, you've got dinner and probably leftovers. Because pasta always underestimates its own portion size. 1 cup dry feeds a village. Every time. So no, pasta didn't usher in the Renaissance or light up the world, but it did give us a reason to gather, to cook, and to smile while slurping noodles in front of Netflix in our oldest pajamas. The toilet, a throne worth fighting for. Let's talk about one of history's most quietly heroic inventions, the toilet. Elegant? No. Glamorous? Definitely not. But in terms of improving human life, it's up there with fire and antibiotics. Except, instead of curing disease, it helped prevent people from spreading it in the streets. Literally, long before flush handles and porcelain bowls, using the bathroom was more of a freestyle experience. In ancient times, your options included holes in the ground, chamber pots under the bed, or, if you were feeling bold, hanging your rear over the edge of a castle wall, and hoping the moat below had good aim. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous, messy, and the olfactory equivalent of being slapped in the face by a medieval sock. Before toilets, your bathroom was wherever shame wasn't. Ancient Rome, to its credit, had some decent plumbing. Public latrines were stone benches with keyhole-shaped holes, where you could sit side by side with your fellow citizens and debate politics while doing your business. Privacy? Not so much. But hey, community bonding, hygiene, debatable. They shared a communal sponge on a stick, which they'd rinse in a bucket of water and pass to the next user like a very unfortunate baton in the world's least pleasant relay race. Fast forward to medieval Europe and the fall of Rome's sanitation genius, and things got significantly worse. Most people just tossed waste out their windows with a shout of "Gardloo," a phrase that roughly meant duck and cover. Streets ran with filth, and diseases like cholera and typhoid thrived like rats at a cheese festival. It wasn't just gross, it was deadly. Enter the modern toilet, and with it, sweet, sanitary salvation. In 1596, Sir John Harrington, godson to Queen Elizabeth I, and history's first official bathroom innovator, designed a flushing toilet. It had a cistern and everything. The Queen was reportedly impressed, but for the next couple centuries the idea didn't catch on, possibly because people still thought bathing too often would kill you. So flushing waste was a bit ahead of its time. It wasn't until the 19th century, when urban populations exploded and cholera made frequent unwanted appearances, that governments finally said, you know what, maybe we shouldn't let people poop wherever they want. Thus, the toilet became not just a convenience, but a necessity for public health. This invention saved more lives than antibiotics, and flushed them too. Enter Thomas Crapper. Yes, really, the Victorian-era plumber and businessman who didn't invent the toilet, but did improve it, mass-market it, and forever link his name with bathroom humour. He made flushing stylish. He made indoor plumbing accessible. He made sure that you no longer had to walk outside in the snow at 3 a.m. just to regret eating stew. And the impact? Monumental. Toilets revolutionized public health. They reduced the spread of disease, made cities livable, and gave humans everywhere the glorious gift of privacy. No more outhouses. No more chamber pots. Just porcelain solitude and the ability to sit, scroll, and contemplate the mysteries of the universe. Or at least the unread messages in your group chat. A world-changing invention, and the only one where we all sit and ponder life's mysteries. Toilets also paved the way for sewage systems, wastewater treatment, and the idea that maybe sanitation matters. It was one of the key technologies that helped cities transition from plague-ridden chaos to modern civilization. Basically, without toilets, your favorite coffee shop probably wouldn't exist, because no one wants to sip a latte next to a cesspool. And sure, we don't talk about toilets much. They're not the flashy kind of invention that gets a museum exhibit or a national holiday, though they absolutely should, but let's give them their due credit. Every time you flush, you're participating in one of humanity's greatest public health victories, while also, let's be honest, avoiding whatever responsibilities you were supposed to be handling. The humble toilet has come a long way. From Roman benches to bidets with heated seats and Bluetooth, we've gone from survival to luxury. Modern toilets can analyze your health, warm your backside, and play music while you handle your business. And to think it all started with a hole in the ground and a dream. So next time you're sitting on your porcelain throne, remember, this isn't just a break, it's a triumph of engineering. It's a monument to cleanliness. It's the final frontier where everyone is equal, because no matter who you are, eventually you've got to go. Congratulations, you've just arrived at the Western Front, the prestigious, mud-covered stage of the First World War, where dreams go to die and socks go to rot. You were promised valor. You imagined bayonet charges, crisp uniforms, maybe a medal or two. Instead, you're greeted with a trench that smells like damp fear, communal misery, and beans that taste like betrayal. Let's rewind a bit. It's 1914. The war kicks off, and people are cheering in the streets, like it's half-time at the World Cup. Young men enlist in droves, imagining a quick fight, a heroic photo, and a victorious march home by Christmas. Spoiler, that Christmas would be spent ankle-deep in mud, ducking shells, and asking, why does everything itch? The first few days after deployment are a blur. You're herded onto a train that rattles like it's held together by string and optimism, then marched across France to the front. You pass towns with broken windows and locals who no longer bother waving. The smell of smoke, manure, and whatever the army calls stew lingers in the air. You try to stay upbeat. Your boots are shiny. Your rifle is polished. You don't yet know how many things you're going to lose in the mud, morale included. Then you arrive. Your first glimpse of the trench is not majestic. It's more open grave with roommates than fortified military position. A zigzagging ditch carved out of the earth, filled with water, mystery stains, and the occasional boot without a foot in it. The walls are made of crumbling mud, lined with sandbags, and someone thoughtfully installed a plank of wood to stand on while your soul contemplates its regrets. You take your first steps into the trench and immediately sink ankle deep in muck. This isn't ordinary mud. This is sentient, personality-having, soul-absorbing trench mud. It knows your name. It's here for your socks, and it's not leaving. Your commanding officer gives you a quick tour, which mostly consists of pointing at things and saying, "Don't touch that, don't drink that, and definitely don't sleep there." You're handed a shovel and a rifle in the same breath. Both are equally important. One is for fighting. The other is for digging your temporary home/tomb. You're not sure which is supposed to be more comforting. Then there's the noise. Shells whistling in the distance, machine guns rattling like angry typewriters, and the occasional shout of incoming that makes you reconsider every life choice that brought you here. You learn quickly that silence is more terrifying than noise. Silence means something's coming, and it's probably big, loud, and covered in barbed wire. The first night is unforgettable, in the same way food poisoning is unforgettable. You try to sleep in shifts, tucked into a dry corner of the trench, which still manages to drip on you. You're using your backpack as a pillow, your coat as a blanket, and your willpower as mosquito repellent. Every few minutes someone yells something unintelligible, and half the trench scrambles like startled raccoons. You check your rifle about 20 times, not out of preparedness, but because it gives you something to do other than contemplate mortality. Culture shock doesn't even begin to describe it. One day you were at home eating dinner and complaining about the price of bread. Now you're crouched in a ditch next to a man named Alfie, who hasn't bathed since Belgium and swears his socks are growing things. Your sense of dignity erodes by the hour. Personal space? Gone. Hygiene? Optional. Privacy? What's that? You quickly learn that your new normal includes relieving yourself in a tin can, while 3 other guys argue about who gets the next smoke break. But oddly enough, amidst the discomfort and dread, you also feel something else. Camaraderie. Trench life isn't about the glory. It's about not losing your mind in a human ant farm that occasionally explodes. You share stories, pass around what's left of the rations, and learn to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Because if you don't laugh, you might start screaming, and no one wants to be that guy on their second day. By the end of the first week, your clothes are permanently damp, your boots have fused to your feet, and you've developed a sixth sense for incoming artillery. You still don't understand the strategy of the war, but you know your section of trench intimately, where the best place to duck is, which sandbag leaks, and which rat has claimed ownership of the latrine. The war is just beginning for you, and the trench has many lessons in store, none of them pleasant, all of them unforgettable, because in trench warfare, they promised you glory. They delivered trench foot and cold beans. So you've survived your glorious arrival at the Western Front, gotten cozy with trench mud, and maybe named your first rat roommate. Now comes the part no recruiter mentioned in the posters. You're not just a soldier, you're also a part-time ditch digger with a shovel and a death wish. Welcome to the noble world of trench engineering, or as it's more accurately described, congratulations, you've just been promoted to unpaid mud architect. Let's start with the layout. Trenches weren't just straight lines. Oh no, that would have made too much sense and allowed enemy fire to turn one lucky shot into a soldier smoothie. Instead, they were laid out in elaborate zigzag patterns, like a nervous snake trying to impress a geometry teacher. The technical term is traverse, but it mostly meant that if someone tossed a grenade in your trench, the blast wouldn't kill everyone in one go, just most of them. Efficiency. These zigzags connected to different kinds of trenches, each with a fancy name to make it sound slightly more dignified than it really was. Frontline trenches, where all the action and none of the comfort happened. Support trenches, slightly behind the front and only marginally less horrible. Reserve trenches, basically time-out corners for soldiers to catch their breath, cry, and wonder what happened to their dreams of becoming a baker. Communication trenches, not where you shared feelings, but rather the mud tunnels that ran between everything else, and all of it had to be dug by hand. No bulldozers, no power tools, just shovels, sweat, and the occasional scream. Soldiers became impromptu civil engineers, carving out trenches through mud, chalk, and sometimes bodies. Digging took place at night to avoid becoming target practice, and the only light came from the moon, lanterns, or the warm glow of incoming artillery shells. Barbed wire was the cherry on this horrible Sunday. Miles of it were laid out in no man's land to tangle enemy troops, and also the occasional distracted pigeon. You learned very quickly that if barbed wire didn't maim you, it would definitely ruin your trousers. Some soldiers spent whole nights fixing it under cover of darkness, bent over in the mud, praying the enemy didn't have a flare gun and a sense of timing. Inside the trenches themselves, things got innovative. Duckboards, long wooden planks, were placed on the trench floors to stop your boots from disappearing into the mud. These were supposed to keep feet dry, but after the first rainfall, the boards themselves often vanished into the sludge, like ancient offerings to the gods of despair. If you fell off one, congratulations, you'd just earned a full-body exfoliation courtesy of stagnant trench water and something squishy you don't want to think about. Then there were the sump pits, which sound luxurious until you realize their purpose: collecting water so the trench didn't turn into a swimming pool for rats. These pits were dug with obsessive regularity, cleaned out constantly, and usually filled with a toxic stew of rainwater, waste, blood, and the occasional disoriented frog. The best part? They often didn't work, and the trench still flooded. Nature, undefeated. Want more luxury? How about parapets and parados? Fancy names for the raised banks at the front and rear of the trench made of sandbags and dirt. These were your shields against bullets and bombs, unless it rained. Then they just melted like sugar cubes in a tantrum, and none of this was permanent. Trench construction was an endless, soul-numbing cycle. Rain collapsed walls, enemy shells blew holes in everything, and just when you thought your sandbags were stable, some joker threw a grenade and undid your weekend's hard work. You rebuilt every night. You patched holes between firefights. You tried to improve drainage systems like a municipal contractor who got drafted. Then there's trench furniture. Wooden planks served as benches. Ammo boxes became tables. If you were lucky, someone dragged an old chair from a bombed-out house into the dugout, instantly elevating your trench's Yelp rating from 1 to 1.5 stars. Every trench had a dugout area, a small hole carved into the wall where you could theoretically sleep, though in practice it was more often a haven for spiders and someone else's socks. And let's not forget the weatherproofing. You'd try to hang tarps, but high winds would rip them down faster than you could mutter. Well, there goes my dry blanket. The trench had a seasonal personality: ice in winter, swamp in spring, sauna in summer, and complete emotional breakdown in autumn. Despite all this, trench engineers did incredible work under impossible circumstances. They created drainage systems with what little they had, reinforced walls with sticks and sandbags, and kept entire sections from collapsing, even while being shelled. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't pretty, but it kept thousands alive just a little longer. By the end of your first month, you can recite the specifications of a trench like a realtor, describing a 2-bedroom in hell. You dream in barbed wire. You rank sump pits by stink. You begin to think, maybe after the war I'll go into construction, or maybe not, because if war is hell, then trench building is the part where the devil hands you a shovel and says, start digging. So you've mastered the art of trench engineering, and now you're settling into your new home. Mud, damp, and all. But there's one thing your recruiters definitely forgot to mention. You're not alone. Welcome to trench life's ultimate horror show. Your roommates. No, not the friendly kind who borrow your socks and forget to return them. These guys are bigger, meaner, and downright disgusting. We're talking rats, lice and fleas, the true rulers of the Western Front. Let's start with the rats. And no, these weren't your average garden variety pests. These trench rats were the size of small dogs, the unchallenged champions of scavenging and general grossness. Their diet, mostly the casualties of war, leftover food scraps, and if you were unlucky, your personal belongings. They were the original clean-up crew, but without the courtesy of calling ahead. Soldiers often reported waking up to find these rat beasts crawling over them in the night. Not exactly the cuddle buddies you hoped for. Some even claimed their beds were shared with rats. So large they might as well have been small bears with a serious attitude problem. If you dropped your chocolate bar or a piece of bread, the rats were on it faster than a sergeant's whistle on inspection day. Despite their fearsome reputation, the rats were surprisingly tough. Shellfire, poison, traps, nothing stopped them. They even survived on raw meat, mud, and whatever else the trenches offered. So while the soldiers were dodging bullets and shells, the rats were conducting their own little war over territory, food, and probably who smelled worst. Now onto the less obvious but equally terrifying invaders. Lice. These microscopic vampires weren't just annoying, they were the unofficial cause of trench fever, a nasty illness that could put a soldier out of action for weeks. Scratching was the daily routine, and not just because itchy skin is distracting. It was a serious attempt to keep the little bloodsuckers at bay. Lice thrived in the filthy conditions of the trenches. Clean clothes, rarely, regular baths. Forget about it. Soldiers were stuck in the same uniforms for weeks, sometimes months, providing a perfect breeding ground for lice colonies. Every scratch and itch was a reminder that your personal space had been invaded by creatures that somehow hated you more than the enemy did. The army tried everything to fight back. Delousing stations popped up where soldiers' uniforms were fumigated or boiled, but the process was slow, and soldiers often re-infested themselves as soon as they went back to the trenches. Imagine spending half your day being doused in chemicals, only to return to the same itchy nightmare. If only someone had invented the world's first anti-itch app. Then there were the fleas. Those tiny little tormentors who jumped from one unlucky soldier to another, biting through fabric and skin alike. Flea bites were painful and could cause infections, but their real talent was making soldiers crazy. The constant irritation led to sleepless nights and frayed nerves, turning the already tense environment into a frenzy of itching, swearing, and occasionally desperate attempts to smack invisible bugs on your face. The effort to control these pests was less pest control and more pest negotiations. Soldiers adapted bizarre rituals, like hanging clothes near fires and praying they didn't burn, rubbing mud on their bodies to suffocate lice, or simply trying to ignore the madness while secretly plotting to start a rat rebellion. The trenches were a war zone not just between nations, but between man and insects were winning. The phrase, sharing your space, took on a whole new meaning when it included hundreds of lice and a rat or two. Soldiers developed a weird camaraderie with their tiny tormentors. Complaints about the enemy often gave way to stories about the size of last night's rat, or the best tricks for itching without making a sound during a night watch. It was the kind of humor born from desperation, a way to stay sane when surrounded by mud, death, and an army of crawling pests. In the end, these unwelcome companions became part of the trench identity. The itchy, scurrying, gross reality no one could escape. The rats, lice, and fleas were a reminder that no matter how advanced the war machines got, nature's tiniest warriors always found a way to fight back. So the next time you think about the horrors of war, remember this: the real battle wasn't always against the enemy across the wire. Sometimes, it was just trying to stay awake long enough to scratch an itch, while a rat tried to nick your rations and your sanity. Imagine it's mealtime at the front lines of World War I. You're wet, cold, exhausted, and more than a little hungry. You might think this is your moment to savor a warm meal, a brief escape from the horrors around you. Spoiler alert, it's not. Welcome to Café de Trench, where the menu boasts 3 delicacies: hardtack, bully beef, and whatever the cook forgot to burn. First up, hardtack, the unholy grail of trench rations. This dense, rock-hard biscuit was essentially a brick masquerading as food. Designed to last months without spoiling, it was tougher than a sergeant's glare, and twice as dry. Soldiers joked that it could be used as a weapon, or at least to knock sense into the new recruits. Eating hardtack was like gnawing on a piece of your own boot, with the added bonus of risking your teeth. Legend has it that soldiers would try to soften it by dunking it in tea or water, but more often than not, this resulted in a soggy, tasteless mess that was only slightly more edible. Next on the menu, bully beef. This wasn't a gourmet cut, but a can of tinned corned beef that smelled vaguely of metal and desperation. Open the can, and you'd be greeted by a salty, greasy slab of meat that was more glue than steak. But hey, it was protein, and protein was life. Soldiers developed some creative culinary hacks, like mixing bully beef with hardtack crumbs or scavenged vegetables, if you were lucky enough to find any, to make something vaguely resembling stew. It wasn't exactly Michelin star quality, but it kept people going. Then there were the rum rations, which might just have been the best part of the whole ordeal, issued as a morale booster and a way to keep the spirits up. The rum was often watered down to make it last longer, or sometimes replaced with inferior, almost unrecognizable alcohol. But for many soldiers, that warm, slightly fiery gulp was the only moment of comfort in a day full of misery. It was also occasionally used as a painkiller, disinfectant, and as one soldier famously noted, a liquid excuse to forget what day it is. Of course, the trenches were not immune to the chaos of war, and food shortages were a constant threat. Supply lines were fragile, and when a shipment of rations failed to arrive, the men had to get creative. This led to the invention of some truly experimental recipes that would make modern chefs cringe or run screaming. Some soldiers became experts in what could only be described as culinary improvisation, combining whatever scraps they could find. One popular dish was mud stew, a suspicious-looking concoction made by tossing dirt, whatever vegetables were scavenged from the fields, and a questionable chunk of bully beef into a pot, and boiling it all until it was barely recognizable. The taste? Let's just say it was a gamble, and not one you wanted to lose. If the rats didn't steal the food first, and they often did, then the cook had probably already ruined it. Food preparation in the trenches was a hazardous endeavor. Cooking over open flames in muddy, cramped spaces often resulted in burnt offerings or undercooked meals that could cause more harm than good. There were tales of cooks accidentally dropping entire pots of stew into the mud, or using rancid ingredients because there was simply no alternative. Breakfast wasn't much better. It usually consisted of cold tea, sometimes barely warm water, and whatever leftovers were left from the night before. If you were lucky, you might get some biscuits or porridge. But often, breakfast was just the sad prelude to another day of mud, misery, and shellfire. Despite the awfulness of the food, the soldiers found ways to bond over mealtime, sharing stories, swapping rations, and complaining about the latest delicacies created a small sense of normalcy amid the chaos. Food was more than sustenance. It was a lifeline, a brief moment of humanity in a world gone mad. And let's not forget the rumors of special treats. Soldiers would whisper about the elusive fresh bread, a luxury so rare it might as well have been a myth, or the day someone found a stash of chocolate bars, which instantly became the most prized treasure in the trench. These stories kept hope alive, even if the reality was usually a soggy biscuit and a side of mud. In the end, trench food was less about flavor and more about survival. It was a test of endurance, not just of the body, but of the spirit. Soldiers learned to laugh at the absurdity of their meals, making jokes like, "If the rats didn't steal it, the cook already ruined it," or "I've had better meals in the mud puddle back home." So next time you complain about your lunch, remember the soldiers in the trenches. They didn't get a choice between gourmet and fast food. Their dining experience was a daily reminder that war was not just fought with guns and grenades, but with whatever scraps you could scrape together in a muddy hole filled with rats and fear. Sleep, that mysterious luxury we take for granted in the civilized world, was the rarest commodity on the Western Front. In the trenches of World War I, catching some shut-eye wasn't just difficult, it was a game of survival. The phrase, "sleep like a baby," would have been cruelly ironic, because these babies were awake, terrified, and occasionally screaming. From the moment soldiers arrived, they quickly learned that sleep was a luxury, like dry socks or not being shelled at 3 a.m. Imagine trying to rest in a cramped, muddy trench filled with snoring comrades, endless vermin, and the ever-present thudding of distant artillery. It's hard to relax when the ground shakes like a giant stomping ground, and every shadow could be the harbinger of doom. First, there was the constant threat of enemy shelling. Artillery was the dominant killer on the front, and its booming barrage could start without warning. 1 minute, you might be nodding off, and the next, the earth would erupt in a cacophony of noise and flying dirt. Soldiers described it as being inside a drum that someone is furiously banging on. Good luck sleeping through that. Sleep often came in small, shattered pieces. A few minutes here, a doze there, always with one eye half open and your hands on your rifle. Then came the patrols and sentry duty. Even in the dead of night, someone had to be awake, peering through the fog, listening for enemy movements, and ready to raise the alarm. For those unlucky enough to be assigned to guard duty, sleep was simply out of the question. These night owls became experts in staying alert, despite exhaustion, relying on adrenaline, sheer stubbornness, and the occasional swig of cold tea or rum. The cold was another relentless enemy. Winter nights in the trenches were brutal. Imagine trying to sleep in clothes damp from days of rain, with mud seeping into every corner, and a chill that crept into your bones like a slow poison. The mud wasn't just a nuisance during the day. At night, it became a freezing, uncomfortable mattress. Soldiers huddled together for warmth, but even body heat was sometimes not enough. One veteran grimly noted, "You'd trade a warm bed for a dry hole and a little peace." But neither came often. And speaking of holes, your sleeping quarters were often little more than shallow dugouts or cramped bunkers. Privacy was a foreign concept. Men slept shoulder to shoulder in muddy trenches, often sharing space with strangers they'd never met before. The camaraderie built here was born of necessity. You needed someone to watch your back, and they needed you to do the same. But sharing a muddy hole meant sharing something else too. The endless parade of vermin, rats, lice, and fleas were not just pests. They were full-time roommates. Trying to get a peaceful night's sleep while being nibbled on by thousands of tiny, itchy creatures was about as close to hell as you could get without actual fire and brimstone. Soldiers joked that sleeping in the trenches meant being pestered by your new best friends, the rats, who sometimes snuck off with your boots or biscuits, and the lice, who held nightly dance parties on your scalp. Sleep deprivation had a devastating effect on morale and mental health. Soldiers reported vivid hallucinations, paranoia, and a creeping sense of despair that gnawed away at their resolve. The term shell shock, what we now recognize as PTSD, partly stemmed from the relentless exhaustion combined with trauma. Some soldiers found brief moments of respite in sleeping shifts or improvised rest huts, but these were rare and usually short-lived. Despite all this, soldiers developed unique coping strategies to catch whatever half-naps they could. Some tried to sleep standing up or leaning against the trench walls, while others learned to sleep through the most horrifying noises by sheer force of will. There was also an unspoken competition. Whoever could claim the best spot in the trench, dry, slightly warmer, and with fewer rats, was considered the luckiest soldier alive. Sometimes, humor helped them survive the madness. They'd joke that the real enemy was not the bullets, but the constant battle for a dry, quiet corner. One soldier quipped, "I'd trade my rifle for a hammock and a noise-cancelling helmet. But then, that wouldn't be war, would it?" Another said, "Sleep? I haven't had a full night's rest since I joined. It's like a bad relationship. Full of noise, uncomfortable positions, and zero respect for your personal space." In the rare moments of peace, soldiers tried to make the most of their brief sleep. One diary entry reads, "I closed my eyes for what felt like an eternity, only to wake up covered in mud, and wondering if I was dreaming or just still stuck in the trenches." Ultimately, sleep was more than rest. It was a lifeline, a chance to recharge the mind and body amid the unending chaos. Every stolen moment of sleep was fought for, cherished, and savored. It was proof that even in the darkest times, the human body and spirit refused to give up completely. So next time you grumble about a sleepless night or a noisy neighbor, remember the soldiers of the Great War, trying to catch a few winks while under constant bombardment, sharing a muddy hole with strangers and rats named Greg. Sleep was a luxury, yes, but it was also a battleground, where victory was measured in minutes, not hours. No man's land. The ultimate do-not-enter zone that sat, quite literally, between the opposing trenches, like a scarred, cratered no-go zone of death, mud, and regret. Imagine a place where the earth is churned up by countless explosions, tangled with barbed wire that looks like it was crafted by a sadistic artist, and littered with the remains of unfortunate souls who tried to cross it. No Man's Land was the physical embodiment of a bad idea, but also the central stage for some of the most desperate and terrifying moments of World War I. For those new to trench warfare, The concept might sound simple. Just cross the space between the trenches, take out the enemy, and claim the land. Sounds like a brisk walk in the park, right? Except the park here was a blasted wasteland, often no wider than a football field, but packed with so many dangers, it might as well have been a level in a video game called Impossible, the real edition. This barren expanse was crisscrossed with barbed wire entanglements. Not just a few strands, but dense, tangled webs that could easily snag a soldier's uniform, rifle, or worst of all, his limbs. The wire was deliberately designed to slow down any attacker, making them perfect targets for machine guns waiting patiently on the other side. If you made it past that, you'd have to contend with shell holes turned into muddy pools, sharp, jagged craters, and the occasional piece of unexploded ordnance just waiting to remind you of your poor life choices. Scouting missions into no man's land were among the most nerve-wracking tasks a soldier could face. Usually conducted under the cover of darkness, these missions were meant to gather intelligence on enemy positions, wire placements, or to retrieve the bodies of fallen comrades. But they were also a terrifying dance with death. Every step forward risked stepping on a concealed tripwire, or stumbling into enemy patrols, who were just as desperate to find out who was lurking on their side. Night raids into no man's land added another layer of madness. Imagine crawling forward inch by inch, trying not to make a sound, while the ground beneath you squelched with mud, and the air was thick with fear and the smell of cordite. If spotted, it wasn't just a firefight. It was a brutal struggle, where every second counted, and retreat was often just as dangerous as advancing. Living just a few feet from this hellscape played havoc on soldiers' psyches. The constant knowledge that death or injury could come from any direction, any moment, created a profound psychological toll. You weren't just fighting the enemy, you were fighting the environment itself. This ever-present tension was a slow, grinding pressure that chipped away at mental resilience, contributing to the infamous shell shock and anxiety that haunted many veterans long after the war. One soldier described no man's land as a place where hope goes to die, and the only plants that grow are barbed wire and bad decisions. It was a psychological minefield as much as a physical one. Even when not actively fighting, the mere sight of no man's land could induce a sense of dread so intense it left men trembling. Despite all this, the military brass insisted on launching assaults across no man's land, often with tragic predictability. The tactic usually involved a mass charge, where hundreds or thousands of soldiers would sprint across this cratered wasteland under heavy fire. The phrase "going over the top" became a grim euphemism for this deadly dash. The funny, if morbid angle, is that no man's land was anything but a strategic masterpiece. One sarcastic soldier summed it up perfectly. No man's land, because nothing says great strategies like sprinting across a crater field full of corpses. It was a killing zone, sure, but a testament to stubborn military doctrine that valued bravery, or sometimes just the desire to keep up appearances over common sense. On quieter days, no man's land became a grisly monument to the war's futility. Soldiers reported seeing the remains of previous charges scattered across the terrain, broken rifles, torn uniforms, and sadly, bodies that were never recovered. The land itself seemed to mourn the countless lives lost in its muddy grasp. In some cases, opposing soldiers developed an unspoken, eerie respect for no man's land's brutal neutrality. During rare moments of ceasefire, or in the early morning fog, the two sides would sometimes glimpse each other across the wasteland, sharing a fleeting recognition that they were all stuck in the same nightmare. But the real horror of no man's land was that it was both a physical and symbolic barrier. It represented everything the war had become: endless, grinding, senseless slaughter for tiny bits of earth that meant little beyond pride and propaganda. Ultimately, no man's land was less a battlefield and more a gruesome no man's zone, where the rules of survival were rewritten daily. It tested soldiers' courage, endurance, and sanity to their limits. Every inch gained came at a terrible cost, reminding everyone involved why this war was dubbed the Great War, not because of greatness, but because of the scale of suffering and sacrifice. So next time you think about WWI, picture that blasted stretch of earth between the trenches, a place no one wanted to be, yet everyone was forced to cross. A place where death lingered like a bad smell, and courage was measured in how fast you could sprint, or how quietly you could crawl, through mud, wire, and endless regret. When you imagine World War I trenches, your mind probably jumps straight to muddy misery, deafening shellfire, and rats the size of small dogs. But wait, there's more, a lot more. Because when you're stuck in a muddy ditch for weeks or months on end, constantly waiting for the next barrage or charge, you have to find ways to keep your mind from turning to mush. Enter the weird and wonderful world of trench entertainment and boredom management. The original How to Survive Being Stuck in Hell manual. First off, let's get this straight. Boredom was the other enemy. Sure, bullets and bombs wanted to kill you, but the sheer tedium of trench life was trying to slowly erase your will to live. Days, sometimes entire weeks, could pass without any major action. No fighting, no glory, just a lot of mud, rats, and the overpowering scent of, well, let's just say, eau de trench. So how did soldiers keep their sanity? The answer lies in cards, crude humour, and more questionable activities than you'd think. Playing cards was the classic go-to. Almost every trench was home to a pack of soldiers with a worn deck, huddled around makeshift tables, or even just the muddy ground. Cards weren't just about passing time, they were a form of social glue. Poker, whist, and other games offered distraction and a chance to momentarily forget the mud underfoot and the shells overhead. Losing a hand might have meant losing a cigarette or some precious chocolate, both currency more valuable than gold in the trenches. Then there were the trench newspapers. Yes, newspapers created by the soldiers themselves. These homemade publications ranged from satirical to downright absurd, often filled with jokes, poems, gossip, and sketches poking fun at everything, from the generals back home to the daily struggles of trench life. It was a way to laugh in the face of misery, a defiant reminder that even in the worst conditions, humour could survive. Some of these newspapers were so popular that copies would be passed along the lines, spreading morale as fast as a well-timed joke. Songs were another favourite. Soldiers wrote and sang crude, cheeky songs to kill the silence and vent frustration. Lyrics about endless mud, the incompetence of officers, or the irritating habits of fellow soldiers like Private Jenkins, whose socks were reportedly the stuff of nightmares, became staples. The songs weren't exactly chart toppers, but they did the job of bonding troops and making the unbearable just a little more bearable. You could say they were the original wartime memes. Speaking of Private Jenkins and his socks, boredom also led to some questionable pranks and escapades. The soldiers, desperate to break the monotony, got creative. Pranks ranged from the innocent, like hiding boots or swapping helmets, to the more elaborate, such as rigging crude exploding devices that went off with a loud bang but little damage. Sometimes, it was less about danger, and more about the hilarity of watching a mate jump out of his skin. These antics might seem trivial, but they were crucial for morale, a reminder that life and laughter could persist amidst death and destruction. When you're trapped in a trench, you don't have the luxury of a TV, a book, or even a smartphone app to distract you, so soldiers improvised, inventing homemade games to keep their minds active. Dice made from scrap bone or wood, marbles, or even simple hand-clapping games passed time. Cardboard chessboards or checkers sets were crafted with the finest trench craftsmanship, read, scratched into anything remotely flat. These games weren't just diversions, they were lifelines, brief windows into normalcy amid the chaos. Humour itself became a kind of survival mechanism. When you're too tired to fight, but too awake to ignore the smell of Private Jenkins' socks, you laugh because crying isn't really an option. Jokes and banter helped build camaraderie and create a small bubble of humanity in a place designed to crush it. There was a certain gallows humour to it all, dark and sharp as a bayonet, but it kept many soldiers sane. This constant struggle against boredom also had an unexpected upside. It sparked some genuine creativity. Soldiers would write poetry and short stories, sometimes sending them back home or keeping them secret to share with close comrades. These works captured the raw, brutal experience of trench life, but also the humour, the absurdity, and the stubborn hope that clung on despite everything. Of course, boredom didn't always bring out the best. Some soldiers, overwhelmed by monotony and fear, fell into despair or acted recklessly just to feel alive. Discipline was critical, but the line between brave and foolish was thin when every moment dragged on like a slow-motion nightmare. In short, trench entertainment was a patchwork of whatever could be found, invented or stolen, all stitched together by necessity, and a desperate need to maintain a shred of sanity. It might not have been glamorous, or even particularly effective in the grand scheme of war, but it was real, raw, and deeply human. So next time you picture WWI soldiers, don't just think of mud and misery. Imagine them shuffling cards, singing terrible songs, plotting pranks, and telling jokes that would make your grandpa cringe. Because in the trenches, entertainment wasn't just fun, it was survival. If you thought mud, rats, and constant shelling were the worst parts of trench life, congratulations, you've met the real nightmare: trench hygiene, or the complete lack thereof. For soldiers stuck in those narrow, waterlogged ditches, hygiene was less a priority and more a cruel joke. In fact, hygiene might as well have been a mythical creature, like a unicorn or a polite bar fight. The trenches were cesspools of misery, where diseases ran rampant like unwelcome guests at a never-ending party. Imagine months trapped in soggy, muddy tunnels, sharing cramped space with hundreds of sweaty, dirty comrades, countless rats, and barely enough water to wash your face, let alone your entire body. The result, a health disaster of epic proportions that went far beyond gunshots and shrapnel. One of the most dreaded afflictions was trench foot. This wasn't some minor annoyance, but a full-blown medical nightmare, caused by prolonged exposure to damp, unsanitary, and cold conditions. Trench foot began as numbness and swelling, but could quickly turn gangrenous, leading to the painful amputation of toes or even entire feet. Imagine standing in freezing mud day after day, unable to change your socks or dry your boots, and then finding your feet slowly rotting from the inside out. Soldiers described it as walking on bricks, then nails, then fire, and that was the mild version. But trench foot wasn't the only foot-related horror. There was also trench fever, transmitted by the ubiquitous lice swarming every inch of clothing and skin. Lice weren't just annoying, they were the carriers of serious illnesses that knocked soldiers out for weeks with fever, headaches, and muscle pain. Getting rid of lice was a constant, frustrating battle. Soldiers tried everything from boiling clothes to bathing in makeshift showers when possible, but the lice were stubborn, thriving in the perfect storm of trench conditions. And speaking of unsanitary conditions, dysentery was another major problem. When your toilet is basically a hole dug somewhere behind the lines, and your drinking water is often contaminated with mud and sewage, digestive diseases spread like wildfire. Dysentery caused severe diarrhea, dehydration, and weakness, sometimes killing soldiers faster than bullets. It was a grim reminder that in war, the environment itself could be a merciless enemy. Now, add to this terrifying mix gangrene, a bacterial infection that set in when wounds weren't cleaned properly, something all too common in muddy, chaotic battlefield conditions. Without antibiotics, which hadn't been invented yet, gangrene often meant amputation was the only option to save a soldier's life. Picture surgeons working by candlelight in filthy field hospitals, having to decide who would lose a limb, all while trying to avoid fainting from the smell and sight of decaying flesh. Speaking of field hospitals, medical care was a patchwork of heroism, improvisation, and grim reality. Medics and doctors worked miracles given the conditions, often risking their lives to drag wounded men from the front lines, then performing surgeries in tents or commandeered buildings. Their tools were basic, anesthesia was limited, and antiseptics were just beginning to be understood. The result was a high rate of infection, sepsis, and death, even among those who made it off the battlefield alive. Despite the horror, medical staff tried every available method to combat these diseases. Soldiers were encouraged to change socks regularly when clean ones were available, apply whale oil to their feet to repel water, and keep trenches as dry as possible. Unfortunately, the endless rain, shell craters filling with water, and constant bombardment made these efforts feel like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a thimble. Soldiers quickly learned to recognize the early signs of trench foot and other illnesses, often self-diagnosing and begging medics for treatment before their conditions worsened. But even with the best care, many suffered long-term effects. Some returned home with permanent disabilities, while others spent months in recovery wards, haunted by the physical and mental scars. And what about the doctors? Well, it wasn't all medical heroics and compassion. The conditions were so gruesome that some medical staff reportedly fainted or became physically ill upon entering the wards. One soldier joked, "The doctor will see you now, if he doesn't faint first." Far from the pristine hospital scenes you might imagine, these makeshift medical stations were chaotic, smelly, and terrifying places, full of suffering but also resilience. Despite all this, Humour was never far from the trenches. Even in the face of disease, soldiers often made grim jokes about their friend Trenchfoot or the itchy negotiations with lice, because sometimes laughter was the only medicine they had. It was a way to keep their spirits up, to bond over shared suffering, and to remind themselves that no matter how rotten the situation, they were still human. In the end, the collapse of hygiene in the trenches wasn't just a byproduct of war. It was one of the most brutal battles soldiers faced daily. It reminded everyone involved that sometimes the smallest things, a pair of dry socks, a clean shave, a bed without rats, were the greatest luxuries imaginable. Hygiene might not have won battles, but its absence made the war that much more hellish. In the trenches, where mud swallowed boots and rats outnumbered men, one of the most treasured lifelines wasn't a weapon or a warm meal. It was a letter from home. The smell of ink on paper carried hope, comfort, and a brief escape from the endless grind of war. But writing those letters? That was an art form in delicate sugarcoating, skilled omission, and just the right hint of bravado. Because telling Mum you're living in a rat-infested mud pit, riddled with explosions, wouldn't exactly help her sleep at night. For soldiers, letters were more than just updates. They were emotional anchors, proof that life outside the trenches still existed. The mail was eagerly awaited, scrutinized for any sign of news about family, friends, or better days ahead. Receiving a letter was like a warm light cutting through the gloom, a reminder that they weren't forgotten. But sending one? That was trickier than it sounds. First, the harsh realities of trench life had to be filtered through layers of censorship and self-preservation. Letters were routinely read by military censors to ensure no sensitive information leaked that could help the enemy. That meant no descriptions of troop movements, no complaints about commanders, and certainly no detailed accounts of the constant shelling or the plague of rats. What made it through was a carefully curated version of events, often more fiction than fact. Soldiers learned to master the delicate balance of honesty and optimism. A typical letter might begin with, "Dear Mother, I am well and in good spirits," even if the writer was knee-deep in mud, sleep-deprived, and counting days until the next artillery barrage. Complaints about trench conditions were either left out or disguised as minor inconveniences. "The weather has been quite damp lately. Might mean I'm freezing and constantly wet. While our meals are satisfactory" was code for the bully beef tastes like it was canned during the Bronze Age. Then came the jokes, those dark gallows humor gems that allowed soldiers to cope. A favorite was the classic, "Today was lovely, just me, 3 rats, and 19 explosions. Send socks." It was the perfect mix of grim reality and absurdity, letting loved ones know they were alive while keeping spirits light. These jokes, though coded, were a reminder, we're still here and we're still human. Writing letters was also a vital routine that gave structure to the chaos. Amid shellfire and sleepless nights, putting pen to paper allowed soldiers to focus on something positive. It reminded them of who they were fighting for and what awaited them beyond the trenches. It was an act of connection, bridging a gap that war had violently torn open. But the emotional weight was immense. Soldiers tried to shield their families from fear, but the pain of separation was impossible to hide completely. Many struggled to find the right words, to sound brave without sounding reckless, hopeful without being dishonest. For some, letters became the only way to express feelings they couldn't say aloud in the trenches: loneliness, fear, longing, and sometimes the letters were never sent, tucked away in pockets or buried in packs, too raw to share. Receiving mail was a different kind of joy and agony. Letters brought news from home, sometimes mundane, sometimes heartbreaking. They reminded soldiers of birthdays missed, illnesses, or even deaths. Yet they also brought comfort, stories of village life, and small gifts like photos, chocolates, or knitted socks, the latter becoming legendary treasures that could lift a soldier's morale on the worst day. And then there was the challenge of time. Letters took weeks, sometimes months, to travel back and forth. The war was constantly shifting, so news was often outdated by the time it arrived. Soldiers would write about days that had already passed, battles that were long over, or comrades who were no longer alive. This lag created a surreal disconnect, a feeling of living in 2 timelines at once, one of hope and one of grim reality. Despite the censorship and delays, letters forged an invisible but unbreakable bond between the trenches and home. They were tokens of love and resilience, small acts of defiance against the dehumanizing grind of war. Soldiers kept every letter, often reading them repeatedly, when loneliness struck hardest. Letters were proof that even in the muddiest, most terrifying places, the human heart kept beating, reaching out, hoping. Of course, not all letters were full of flowery prose. Some soldiers adopted a blunt, sarcastic tone, sending brutally honest missives that probably made family members gasp or giggle nervously. These candid letters, while rare, gave a glimpse behind the carefully constructed curtain of positivity, the sheer exhaustion, the absurdity of military bureaucracy, and the bizarre camaraderie of life in a hole surrounded by death. In a way, the letters home were their own battlefield, a struggle between the harshness of reality and the need to protect loved ones. Soldiers fought to maintain hope on paper, even when the trenches threatened to swallow their very souls. So next time you think a simple letter is just words on a page, remember, in World War I trenches, those scribbled notes were lifelines. They were the only way to say, I'm still here, I'm still fighting, and I'm still hoping you're safe. And sometimes, just sometimes, that was enough. After months, sometimes years, trapped in the endless cycle of mud, shellfire, and rat-riddled misery, the final whistle of World War I's trench warfare was a bittersweet relief. Leaving the trenches wasn't like stepping out of a bad movie set. It was more like dragging a part of yourself out of a swamp that refused to let go. And while the guns might have fallen silent, the war didn't end the moment. Soldiers climbed out of those muddy graves. Instead, they faced a long, complicated goodbye, a farewell to the front lines, a battle to survive psychologically, and the challenge of finding life beyond the endless mud. Let's start with the breaks from the front, those rare, precious respites from the trenches. Soldiers were sometimes granted leave, a brief chance to wash the mud from their clothes and their souls, and get a taste of normal life again. But this was no vacation. The contrast was so sharp that many felt like strangers in their own homes. Imagine going from a daily grind of dodging bullets and sharing space with rats, to trying to explain to your mother why your uniform smelled like something the cat dragged in, and why your hands trembled when you tried to hold a cup of tea. Even during leave, the war clung stubbornly. The psychological damage of trench life was slow and insidious. The phrase shell shock was coined to describe what many soldiers experienced, a term that barely scratched the surface of the trauma. It wasn't just the physical pounding of artillery, but the constant fear, the suffocating anxiety, and the exhaustion that invaded their minds. Nightmares became common. Some soldiers found themselves freezing or shaking uncontrollably, unable to function in normal life. Yet, in those days, understanding mental health was limited, and many who suffered were labelled cowards or weak, adding insult to injury. Survival in the trenches wasn't just about dodging bullets. It was a battle to keep your mind intact. Soldiers developed coping mechanisms: humour, camaraderie, rituals, and sometimes numb acceptance. But when they left, many faced the harsh reality of being forgotten or misunderstood. The war had taken a heavy toll, and the outside world was ill-equipped to help. The adjustment to post-war life was rocky. The trenches were a universe apart from the peaceful towns and cities waiting beyond the front. Many veterans struggled to reconnect with family and friends who hadn't lived through the mud, the noise, and the constant presence of death. The routines of civilian life seemed trivial compared to the raw immediacy of survival they'd known. Jobs were scarce, physical wounds were visible, but the invisible scars were harder to treat. For some, memories of the trenches became a haunted backdrop, an unwelcome companion that crept into dreams and daily life. Veterans found themselves haunted by lost friends, the stench of decay, and the echo of gunfire long after the war ended. Reintegrating into society was less a celebration and more a slow, painful process of rebuilding a shattered identity. Despite the horrors, soldiers often remembered the camaraderie, the shared jokes, the small acts of kindness, and the unbreakable bonds forged in hell. These memories were bittersweet. They offered comfort, but also reminded men of what they'd lost. Many became involved in veterans groups, seeking understanding and solidarity from those who truly got it. And then there was the smell. Yes, the smell. No matter how many baths were taken or clothes changed, many soldiers joked that the smell of damp socks follows you forever. It became a symbol of the trench's inescapable mark on their lives, a pungent reminder that the war was not just a chapter in history, but a permanent part of who they were. The war changed everything. It shattered empires, redrew borders, and transformed societies. But for those who lived it, the end of trench warfare was less an ending, and more a new beginning. One fraught with challenges, pain, and a desperate hope for peace. So the long goodbye wasn't just about leaving the trenches. It was about surviving what came after, because the real victory was not just in winning battles, but in finding a way to live with the memories, the losses, and the legacy of the mud, the rats, and the endless, echoing thunder of war.